in today's episode of Plants of the Gods. Hear ethnobotanist Dr. Mark Plotkin and Dr. Gary Nabhan as we learn about the fascinating plants and animals of the desert, from Mescal to Tequila to magic toads. Dr. Gary Nabhan is an award-winning ethnobotanist and desert conservation biologist with 50 years of botanical, cultural, and conservation research experience. In the first half of a two-part episode, we'll hear about what Mescal and kimchi have in common and how producing these agave-based spirits have become an act of resistance.
I would like to start out by saying that we have a special guest today. We are honored and privileged to have one of the leading lights of ethnobotany, a man I'm proud to call a friend and a colleague, Dr. Gary Nabhan. A little bit of background. Gary is an agricultural ecologist, scientist, humanist, ethnobotanist, ecumenical Franciscan brother, and a certified genius, according to the McArthur Foundation, the only ethnobotanist to be so named. He's a first-generation Lebanese American, and I think that's where his love of the desert comes from. It's not just a hobby and a passion, it's deeply embedded in his genes. And before we get into the interview, let me read a little bit of an introduction from a review I did of one of Gary's books a couple of years ago called Ethnobiology for the Future. And I want to point out that when I was asked to write the review, I said that I would do it as long as Gary promised not to publish 2 more books in the course of me writing the review. Because he's so prolific, it's intimidating to many of us. He has, at last count, written or co-authored over 42 books. And I think it's accurate to say that Gary has written more books than most Americans will ever read. So I wrote, no one has done more than Gary Nabhan to bring the central tenets of ethnobiology to a broader audience, that there is an inextricable link between biological and cultural diversity, that indigenous peoples often know far more about the biological, and especially the agricultural diversity, than do members of industrialized society, and that global well-being is tied to the well-being of biocultural diversity, are constant and consistent themes that have clearly and consistently threaded through most of his writings for well over a decade. Today we want to focus on his newest book on agave and Mescal and Tequila, and I point out that he's written several books on the topic. The new one is called Agave Spirits, the Past, Present, and the Future of Mescals. So Gary's a hard person to describe very briefly, and the person who did it best is a journalist named Mark Dowie, who did it in one of his books that Dowie reviewed in the New York Times in 1997. And he is able to distill the essence of Gary's career to 2 sentences. From almost every scientific discipline has risen a voice that speaks to the laity in clear and coherent sentences. Stephen Jay Gould from paleontology, Carl Sagan from astronomy, Lewis Thomas from medicine, and then there is Gary Paul Nabhan, an ethnobiologist in southern Arizona, whose small but inspiring stories from far outposts of humanity teach us about the tense and tenuous relationship between culture and biological diversity. Thank you and welcome, Gary.
Oh, it's so great to be with you, Mark.
So I want to work backwards, Gary. I want to hear first and foremost about your new book and why, after having written so much about tequila and mezcal in the past, you felt called to write this new magnificent piece.
Well, in a conversation with David Suro, the co-author, who has worked in the industry and in bad and agave conservation for 3 decades, we realized that the whole industry of agave spirits was at a tipping point, a real crisis, not just because of climate change, but also because of the kind of industrialization of the production that was distancing itself from the indigenous traditions that made mezcal what it is. And at the same time, there were real conservation issues emerging with materia prima, the 58 agave species and varieties that are used in distillates. And perhaps 50 to 60% of those wild species used in mezcals are now at risk. So it seemed to be a key time to look back at how the industry has changed over the years and to chart a new future that can make both tequila and mezcal healthier and more sustainable.
Well, as a Franciscan brother, you know well the teachings of St. Francis of Assisi, who taught us to love plants and animals. But it seems to me the problem here, one of the problems here, is we're loving these things to death. Not just tequila and mezcal and the agaves, but peyote, Sonoran desert toads, and all these other species that when you and I started out, nobody paid attention to, and now they're paying too much attention to them in some way.
That's correct. And I think your metaphor, loving them to death, is apt, but it's almost like strangling something you love, because it went from just sheer and sometimes naive appreciation of these plants to not just over harvesting, but taking the richest and best components of the plant, like the inulins that could help Mexicans deal with their epidemic of diabetes, and turning them into high fructose syrups that are just like high fructose corn syrups. So we've taken the very best of a plant and wrung it out, and what we're left on the marketplace is some of the most damaging elements of that.
Well, it seems to me that, the U.S. is in love with tequila and has long regarded mezcal, if they regard it all, as sort of a bastard stepbrother that really wasn't up to par. And I think your new book makes the case that the opposite is true. So can you clarify for all of us in listener land the difference between mezcal and tequila? Because it seems to me there's a lot of confusion.
Well, that's a great point, and that hasn't gone away 20 years after writing Tequila, Natural and Cultural History with Guadalupe Valenzuela. I think, first of all, remember that tequila was once called Vino Mescal de Tequila, and there were dozens, if not hundreds, of place-based distilling traditions all across Mexico that named a very distinctive terroir of mezcal for a particular place. So in Sonora, just south of where I sit right now, is Vino Mescal de Bacanora, now called Bacanora. That's just in the Zona Serrana of Sonora and the Sierra Madre Occidental. But when you begin to try to adapt the European denomination of origin system for this, the words like vino mezcal that unifies all of those distillates disappears, and tequila gets reified as not only the most accessible, but the best of all agave spirits. And I think we could argue the opposite. Tequila is the classic example of monoculture surpassed perhaps only by sugarcane, of a single clone, of a single variety, of a single species, where, as I said earlier, mezcals can be 58 different species and many varieties within that. And whereas tequila uses one industrialized, probably genetically engineered brewer's yeast, mezcal traditionally has been made with one of the greatest batches of microbial diversity that any spirit that reaches our lips grows. It's more like kimchi in ways than it's like European distillates, because it is emerging out of that wonderful symbiosis between plants and microbes that many of the products that you and I have studied over the years are the expressions of that kind of mutualism, not just between cultures and plants, but plants and microbes.
Well, speaking of which, I want to read a favorite quote of mine from your new book, Agave Spirits, which touches on what you're saying. Quote, "As microbiologist Anne Mathis has reminded us, It ain't just beer yeast and common anaerobic bacteria in the fermentation vat. We find protozoans and even nematodes as well. So we'll slowly walk you through the fascinating microbiology, invertebrate biology, biochemistry, and plant physiology of agave spirits later on. But for the moment, trust us, mezcals make other distilled spirits seem like Iowa's monocultures of genetically engineered corn.
We had fun with that one. But really, when you break it down, if you looked at rums, or largely sugarcane, one yeast, vodkas, maybe 3 different grains, one yeast, etc., and sake and mezcal are really the exceptions to the rule, that we've streamlined down the biological diversity embedded in every bottle of distillates. And there are mezcals that are really an expression of resistance against that trend. In fact, many of the mezcaleros that we interviewed from Oaxaca and Puebla up through Sonora and Chihuahua said that they're keeping up their traditions as acts of resistance.
You know, Edward Anderson, the late ethnobotanist, wrote about that indigenous garden in Guatemala, which when he first saw it, thought was just a rat's nest. And it was only after many years of study did he realize the indigenous genius, which is lacking in Iowa cornfield. So that this celebration of diversity and this embrace of diversity, which the culture we live in is sort of heading in the opposite direction to clarify and purify and simplify, has got us into the pickle that we're in. Everything from climate change to crops needing heavy amounts of pesticide to survive in these giant monocultures. So talk a bit about the conservation status of all these useful agaves, which, as you said, there's dozens of species just going into mezcal and other commercial products.
Well, let's break that down into 2 parts. One, what you just mentioned, that lovely paper by Edgar Anderson that inspired many of us to become ethnobotanists. And it showed that people do not, by their very nature, have to diminish diversity in their midst, that they can enrich local diversity by their management of polycultures or agroforestry systems. And you've worked in many of those systems where it's hard to tell some of the tropical rainforest patches from fields that are managed by people. And our friend Daryl Posey and many of the other people that you and I have worked with have documented those kinds of traditions. With agaves, they're part of the milpa system. Milpa does not just mean corn or corn, beans, and squash, but it can be the combination of those annual crops, alley-cropped between agaves, columnar cacti, and the fuel wood sources, the tropical trees that are needed for shade and for mycorrhizal inoculation and soil erosion control, that along with agave's role in soil erosion control, keep these fields or plantations rich in organic matter and nutrients for thousands of years without depleting them. So we know some of these fields are in the very same places where the Spanish first described them, and their soils are still rich. And so when we're talking about mezcal versus agaves, it's not just about biodiversity in the bottle, but it's that way of managing an entire landscape, a cultural landscape, not only for food, but for firewood, medicines, and many of the crafts plants. In fact, one of the richest parts of the biodiversity in the bottle are the infusions or curados that are berries and herbs added to the mezcal itself that may use 120 different kinds of herbs and animal parts to create these fantastic flavors all across Mexico, literally from the U.S. border down to the Guatemalan border.
Well, we hear that the sacred trinity of Native American agriculture in the tropics and semi-tropics is corn, beans, and squash. But when I'm in Oaxaca, I always notice how much agaves are intercropped between those. So it's almost a holy, well, I don't know what would be a holy foursome instead of a holy trinity.
Well, I think it's more like an asylum choir or a symphony or a great jazz band. Different players are coming in and out, many of them perennials. And I think that's what I love about the greater attention to agaves, prickly pear, columnar cacti in the milpa systems, that those cam succulents, the plants with succulent tissue that open their stomatal pores at night, use only a fifth to half the water that corn and beans use to produce the same amount of edible or drinkable biomass over a decade. And since 2/3 of Mexico is arid and semi-arid, agaves and prickly pear are not only adapted to the 5,000 to 7,000 years of agriculture that we have in deserts of North America, but they're going to play an increasingly important role in the future in what I call planet desert, the hotter, drier world that we've already been initiated into this last year.
Well, you define the difference between tequila and mezcal, but there's another drink that figures into this equation, and that's pulque. And in doing my homework and preparing for this session, there seemed to be a bit of a debate in the literature as to whether the pre-Columbian peoples were just drinking pulque or whether they had a system of distillation. Now, if you read most history books, which of course are not written by people who know much about plants, they say that distillation was invented by the Arabs. But some of these recent accounts that these pre-Columbian peoples in Mexico may have had their own form of distillation. So my question to you, Dr. Nabhan, was this distillation invented by your ancestors in Lebanon, or was this distillation developed by your teachers in pre-Columbian Mexico?
Well, on this issue, I can't do a big fat Greek wedding claim of my Eurasian culture inventing everything in the world. And the alambique still from the Arab world did become popular in Mexico, but this debate is still going on, and I love open debates. I think people that slam dunk an issue and don't look at all sides of it are really missing a lot of the fun. So I know people on both sides of this debate, and what I see is a really remarkable thread that's related to your whole podcast series. Are agave distillates eligible to be plant products of the gods? And my sense of it is that there was indeed a tradition of micro distillation in capacha pottery pots that I've seen in person and are capable of distilling small quantities of agave mash or must and giving about a cup or 2 cups per run of these beautiful pottery vessels that came out of the Jalisco Colima era, maybe 1,000 years before, 3,000 years ago is the best way to say it. And some people say, well, what does micro distillation of a cup have to do with what tequila became? And I have 2 responses to that. First of all, it taught people how to distill a product that was also used for medicinal and spiritual purposes. And no one ever says, well, how could peyote be spiritual, or how could wine be spiritual if you're just taking a little sip of wine at a Catholic Mass, or you're having part of a peyote button during Wirikuta ceremony in Huichol country in central Mexico. And the point is, many of our most valued spiritual accompaniments to cultural rituals are minuscule in quantity. Frankincense and myrrh, to begin with, once the most valuable products in the world. And they were moved around, and the highest value products in the world at one time in trade networks. But just a little bit could go a long way. And I think that's true with Mescal too. And so I'd like to tie this whole issue to what we consider a spiritual, psychotropic, and even hallucinogenic experience, that we're using these plants and their derivatives as a launching pad, as a catalyst to get in a different state of consciousness. And we know that probiotic beverages like Tezuino and pulque were also used in religious ceremonies. We know that some of these had infusions of psychotropic plants like the tabentun in Yucatan that used Ipomea and Turbinia vines that are clearly psychotropic. And I don't doubt that there were psychotropic vines added to these micro distillations of mezcals. I think we have a patchy record of all of this because of the incredible efforts by the Spanish to wipe out those traditions immediately after what is now called in a tragic way the conquest.
Well, I stumbled across a very good example of what you're saying that ties together two of this. One is what did the so-called primitive people know that we didn't? And what's the advantage of having a drink that isn't pure alcohol? And that was a professor at Emory who had a grad student looking at some bones of ancient Nubians under the microscope, and the bones fluoresced. That indicates the presence of tetracycline. That was 1,500 years ago, long before Alexander Fleming discovered antibiotics. Similarly, tying back in your comment about frankincense and myrrh, among their many attributes, they kill bacteria. So when you think to the movie The Life of Brian, which is the greatest film ever of the days when Jesus roamed the Holy Land, and they joke about saying, we don't want any more frankincense and myrrh next time, just bring more gold. Actually, frankincense and myrrh were much more important than gold when it comes to the value and the curing of human ailments.
And, we forget in Western culture that alcohol was often used as a solvent by which herbal tinctures and bitters were stored. And so we do great dualistic categories in Western science, and those are often fuzzy sets in indigenous culture, hallucinogenic versus alcoholic. We have this wonderful berry uva lama in Sonora that's related to the chastity bush in Europe, and women infuse the bacanora mezcal that their husbands and grandparents made with this berry that basically triggers male sexual dysfunction, and it may have been a women's way to control male dominance. Your husband's drinking alcohol to get high and rowdy, and all of a sudden a little berry that's infused into the mezcal puts him in his place in a humble way.
Well, in researching the ethnobotany of coffee, there was a point in Europe a couple hundred years ago where the men were spending so much time in the coffee houses that the women wrote a pamphlet complaining that they were spending too much time and too much effort on this whole coffee house culture, that they were returning home, and this is a quote, with nothing stiff but their joints.
Yes, well, we're on a trajectory that we should probably do a U-turn on right now. But the main point I'm saying is that these are fuzzy sets, what we call alcoholic beverages, what we call probiotic beverages, what we call spiritual ceremonial beverages, are all fuzzy sets with examples that cross those boundaries.
Well, as a writer, I think you can appreciate the concept of these plants as not just hallucinogens, but ideogens.
That's right.
These altered states, and I'm talking everything from peyote to tequila to beer, sometimes they're inspirational. Sometimes they just sort of clear the cobwebs out of your mind. You're just thinking differently, new ideas, whatever. And they're overlooked for that. I mean, this goes back to your point about having these strict categories, these silos. Is it a food? Is it a medicine? I mean, if you ask a shaman, is it a food or is it a medicine? The answer is often, what the difference, right? Or it's both.
Right. And I think you and I are both interested in the possibility that some of these probiotic beverages from agave and other plants that we love in Latin America are adaptogens that can help us adapt to climate change, not just that the plants are well adapted and have phenotypic plasticity that helps them adapt to climate change. So one thing that just knocked me over is finding out that agaves consumed as food, along with sotol or the desert spoon plant, Dazzlerian, that grows from Texas all the way over to Arizona and down into Mexico. Men were consuming about 120 to 130 grams of those cam plants a day as soluble fiber, and women maybe 100 to 110 grams a day, which is 5 to 6 times more soluble fiber than any American diet offers you. Miami Beach diet, Pritikin diet, you keep on naming them. None of them get anywhere near that level of soluble fiber, which of course helps flatten blood sugar levels and helps clean out high cholesterol levels. So these plants were adaptogens, not just well adapted to their environment.
Mm-hmm. Well, as the person who has written most eloquently and prolifically on foods, I'd like you to address the concept of the search for new flavors. You know, people are always looking for something new. If you look at tiki culture, we had Beach Bunbury on the pod a couple of episodes ago, and he talked about, the tiki movement and everybody wants the best flavors. But how many ways can you mix pineapple and coconut, right? So he said to me, give me a new flavor I've never even heard of that's going to blow me away. So I brought him some tejate from Oaxaca.
Great.
So talk about these new flavors, these things that are novel to the Western palate, whether it's tejate or prickly pear, and what else is out there and why it's just another reason to protect, preserve, and cherish biodiversity.
Well, again, I'm working on a paper with my friend Cesar Linares Ojeda Vunam about the ethnomicrobiology, the microbiome landscape that many peasant agricultural activities and many kitchen-related activities are based in. And one thing that strikes me is that when you are using the same clay pot to ferment agaves, sometimes pineapple tepache, sometimes corn tezuino, and you're cross-inoculating those different plant products or sugar sources with this rich microbial culture that stays in the pot from generation to generation. Each of the microbes, sometimes 70 different microbial species, 30 yeasts and 40 bacteria, are pulling out different flavor profiles of each of those. It's sort of like a lock and key sort of metaphor that if we only have one yeast, it doesn't have any possibility of pulling out all the flavors and fragrances that's in an agave or a prickly pear or a pineapple or a corn plant for that matter. But when you have a farmer who says, well, we made tepache last week, but let's take the must out of that and put it in our roasted agave culture and see what we get. Wow, you're putting new selective pressures on those microbes, which of course evolve far more faster than the plant, and you're really creating new strains and species over time, just like Mexican, Oaxacan weavers domesticated and proliferated different varieties of cochineal as a dye on prickly pear. So I think we're saying that, there's this funny thing that I had in ethnobiology of the future, that a microbiologist came up to me and said, too bad indigenous people had nothing to do with classifying and really using microbes, because they can't see them, so how would they know what they are? And what he forgot is that flavor and fragrance are named by people, and those names are pretty accurate descriptions of particular compounds. That's why we have all those descriptors for wines that now they've matched with the particular flavor components in a project almost as big as the Human Genome Project. So the new frontier for ethnobiology is going to be ethnomicrobiology, because people have very precise ways of managing a pot full of a brew to obtain different flavors and fragrances and to keep them in their culture.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. This whole issue of ethno-fermentation is a hot topic and a great future. When we now have the tools to look at these creatures and understand them in ways that some of these indigenous people seem to have been doing for thousands of years, if not longer. I mean, you just look at Taxol, which is supposedly from the Pacific U, and it turns out it's not produced by the Pacific U, it's produced by an endophyte inside. So these little microbes are already saving our behinds in ways we didn't even realize up until the present. And I think people fail to realize that products, not just wine, not just Mescal, but chocolate and cheese and coffee are all products of the fermentation process, along with all the other stuff that goes into producing those products that appear in our coffee cups and on our grocery shelves.
And that's why I love Lynn Margulis's wonderful term holobiont, that agaves have these endophytes in them that are literally critical to them adapting to high stress environments. And so endophytic fungi are not only important to those adaptations, but they pull out the linoleuls or the limonene or other fragrance and flavor profiles in the fermented beverages and the distillate beverages. And someone who has had pulque made out of agave americana, if they then have a mescal made out of that same plant, you could blindfold them and they would say, oh, this tastes like the pulque from this place in San Luis Potosi. I'm familiar with this flavor, and they're chemically correct. So it's just not surprising that an oral culture would have that kind of taste and fragrance memory, and it would be a vivid part of their conversations when they're drinking in the evening.
Well, I want to go back to something you said earlier about whether indigenous peoples know and recognize these microorganisms. When I gave the example of the ancient Nubians making this beer, when they tried to recreate the beer in the laboratory, they found that even using the same Saccharomycetes, they did produce tetracycline, but not very much of it, not that would account for the levels found in the bones. So they found out, talking to other microbiologists, that you had to stress the yeast to get them to really crank the stuff out, and figured out that not only did the Nubians find this stuff and know this stuff, they knew enough to stress the Saccharomycetes to get them to crank out the tetracycline over 1,000 years before we figured out how to produce it.
That's just wonderful. And, I want to remind us that those matchups between science and indigenous knowledge are more than just so stories like, oh, isn't that cute? They did the same thing. This really shows the depth of their capacity to identify, recognize, and manage foods or beverages through time in a consistent, deliberate, and conscious way. And so I think we should realize that if we're good scientists, we're humbled all the time by how much complexity there is in the plants and the microbes, and how much complexity is understood by our indigenous colleagues.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please remember to check out other episodes, from ayahuasca to magic mushrooms, from the ethnobotany of warfare to the history and prehistory of wine. Please give us a top rating and subscribe and share with like-minded folks. We appreciate your support for the protection of the knowledge and biodiversity of South America by the Amazon Conservation Team. In our next episode, we'll continue the conversation, learning more about the ceremonial use of agave plants in traditional cultures and fermented beverages in Mexico.